So I think we'll start. Hello, my name's Wendy Craig, and I'm the Scientific Director of PREVNet. And on behalf of our team, I would like to welcome everyone to our webinar today. Wherever you are located, please join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands and in celebrating the continued strength and spirit of the Indigenous peoples. We're extremely excited today to bring you today's webinar from the Community of Practice to address teen and youth dating violence, funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada. Today's webinar is on learning through culture to promote healthy youth relationships, and it's led by the extraordinary Shelley Cardinal, National Senior Manager, Indigenous Community Engagement and Research from the Red Cross, Canadian Red Cross. Before I introduce Shelley, I would like to go through our webinar format for the day. Shelley will present for approximately 55 minutes, and during her presentation, we invite you to type any comments or questions that you may have for her into the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. And we will track these questions and then pull from them and present them to Shelley at the end of her presentation during the last 15 minutes of the webinar. At the end of the webinar, at the end of the webinar in the chat box, you will see a link to the evaluation, and that's the evaluation of this webinar. We really value the responses that people provide to us through these evaluations, and they help guide us when we're planning for future webinars. So all of your feedback is anonymous, so please take the 2 minutes at the end to complete the survey. Once you have completed the evaluation form, you'll be directed to a website where you will be prompted to enter your full name and email address. And once you've done that, a certificate of attendance will be generated and emailed to you. And I just want to stress that even though you fill in that part with your name in order to get the certificate of attendance, your name is not associated in any way with the evaluation. The evaluation is completely anonymous. The webinar is being recorded today, so that after the webinar, we'll send out a link to everybody that registered so they can share the recording or listen to it again, because it will be such valuable and rich information. We will also share the English and French versions of today's slide presentations. We're really interested in disseminating and sharing this information, so please feel free to disseminate it as widely as you wish. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce Shelley Cardinal. Shelley Cardinal is the National Senior Manager for the Indigenous Community Engagement and Research for the Canadian Red Cross, and she is a driving force for creating safe environments in Indigenous communities across the country. Shelley focuses on prevention education, child-centered safety frameworks, Indigenous research, and creating pathways to wellness for Indigenous peoples in various contexts. With an understanding of the many issues facing Indigenous peoples today, creating safe environments is critical to our children and youth's well-being. Shelley works with communities, bringing prevention strategies that can be used to decrease the impact of harm and violence that has in everyday life. A member of the Big Stone Cree Nation in northern Alberta and now based in Victoria, Shelley has worked closely with Indigenous people and communities across Canada for 25 years. She provides leadership that's necessary for creating the change. Shelley has an educational background in psychology and social work with postgraduate education in leadership. I have had the honor and the privilege of knowing Shelley for many years and greatly value and always learn from her new insights and thoughts. So I'm sure that you will learn much today from this fantastic presentation. So I'm delighted to have Shelley here with us today, and I'm now going to turn the presentation over to her. Thank you, Shelley, for joining us, and I look forward to learning new things yet again from you.
Oh, thank you, Wendy. And thank you for the invitation to actually present today and to just spend some time with your community of practice. It's always exciting to share information and share the learning place that we're at right now with new people. I also just wanted to say thank you, Wendy, for acknowledging territory. Like Wendy said, I currently live in Victoria. I live on Lekwungen and Sinchothan speaking people's territory, and I've lived here for I've lived here for about 30 years now. I come from Cree territory in the north myself. And so, but I want to acknowledge the territory where I'm speaking to you from today. And I also want to just acknowledge that we're all together from I think that we're participating from many, many different territories across this beautiful country. I've had years of conversations with Wendy around the work that I'm privileged to do in and with Indigenous communities across Canada. A lot of the work that I've really focused on has been in the area of violence prevention, and I often say now I focus as much on protection strategies as I do on prevention strategies. But to me, as our learning continues, those things go hand in hand, because one thing that we really are learning a great deal about is that the more we increase prevention and the more we participate in working in the area of prevention, what happens is that natural protection strategies increase within community. Those things are a direct result. And so today, a big focus is going to be on various learnings that we have had together with community. So many of those learnings have had to do really, they've really delved into the cultural piece of that learning and the culture, just the cultural influence that exists when we start looking at delving into healthy relationships and healthy youth relationships. In our webinar today, I thought, I was really thinking about some of the things that I really wanted to focus on. One of the things I really would like to focus on is our learning from an Indigenous cultural worldview. It's really interesting. I think that, I'm guessing that there's many of us on the call today that have been involved in either research with Indigenous communities or program development with Indigenous communities. And often what happens is a collective comes together, and we've brought some really good learnings together, and a community will say, can we look at that here? Can we look at that relevance and that understanding with our community? And so what happens then is we take learnings from one place that are situated in one place, and we say, how do those land now within an Indigenous community? And many times what happens is that the journey around that, it turns into a long journey around how that lands. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, around landing place for the programs and services that we work around. I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of historical harm, and why it's necessary to really understand historical harm when we're working, with communities and with Indigenous youth today, and how do we build on real, Indigenous specific strengths and culture and teachings when we're starting to really look at addressing the youth challenges that we have in front of us today. I always like to just put up the just our Red Cross mission statement when I talk about these things. Lots of times I have different questions to me around the Red Cross engagement when we start looking at violence prevention, but Red Cross has actually been working closely in the area of violence prevention for over 30 years in Canada, and we continue that today. We continue that today in our work, probably more so in our work with Indigenous communities actually than in other places and spaces. I thought I would actually first talk a little bit about some research that we have been quite deeply involved in over the last the last 6 years at this point. We myself together under PREVNet, together with Dr. Deborah Pepler, we worked together quite closely for a period of time, and we started to really look at delving into the missing questions when we work in the area of research around violence prevention. You know, it's been a real interesting journey. Violence prevention has been a real interesting journey for me. I started as a social worker many years ago. 23 years ago, I came into the Red Cross, starting to focus on prevention, and a huge reason for that change is that the area of intervention just seemed really it was big, and it was not only big, it was daunting in terms of the amount of change that seemed to be needed within the systems. There was a lot of systems challenge with the area of intervention. And so for me, it felt better to actually move over into the area of prevention. And you know, and so it's interesting because communities, I think that generally speaking, within Canada at that time, we were starting to have a raised awareness of different aspects of violence and aspects of violence that we needed to have greater educational resources and information at the ready. And just simply for us, and we needed to get them into the schools as well. Like we just needed to start sharing information better. And so as that was happening, that was also happening around our work and the work that I've been involved in with Indigenous communities. And so as time went on, we developed resources and educational programs around child abuse prevention, around bullying prevention, around healthy youth relationships. And what we could see in the communities we were working together with is that the information for those in the room was an incredibly helpful piece of information. Those that were present appreciated the information, rated the experience and the value of the content very, very highly. And we really appreciated the programs and communities. The one thing that we also could see over time is that aspects of harm and violence in the community were not actually changing. And for us, we were really concerned about that because we thought what's happening here is that we're still missing some of the pieces that need to come together to help to create change to a more positive place within community. Like we're missing some of the pieces. And so when we started to, and we were applying for different smaller research projects along the way, but we thought, let's actually apply for a bigger research project. And let's start looking at what aspects of community mobilization need to actually happen to bring about community change. Communities were, had deep curiosity, and they said, what's missing? Like, what's missing? Like we're bringing in all these various programs, but if we still have the same challenge at the end as we did at the beginning, then there's pieces of the pie, or there's pieces of information that seem to be missing. So what I want to talk a little bit about some of our learnings around violence prevention, some of our learnings around pathways to wellness that have happened through this, the research that we've done. We've done deep research with 7 different Indigenous communities, 5 of those communities being in Canada. And we've brought this question in. And the one thing that we did differently in this particular research that we hadn't done previously is we thought we're going to actually start with a system of change as opposed to just information on different aspects of harm. We're going to start looking at what does a system of change look like. And so if we bring community together and start looking at what are the actions that they would like to do collectively, then from there, what are the positive things that then actually happen then as a result of that, so that we can actually start to work at a prevention system within community, as opposed to just having an intervention system or many intervention systems within community. So as we've started walking together with community, there's been some really interesting learnings, and for those on the call that have had lots of experience in the area of research, it's always so interesting. There's many different assumptions one comes into learning with, and really early on, we actually realized that we needed to let go of a lot of our assumptions, and we needed to actually look deeply at things that we already thought we knew, and we just things that we thought we knew. One of the things that we thought we knew coming into the research is we thought we knew about the impact of historical harm. For us, that was something that, I know that myself, when I started to do violence prevention programming, I brought a great deal of community story and literature at the time together, and created good resources to help us understand historical harm that was impacting today's challenges. So for me, I thought, I come from a trauma-informed lens. I come from a lens of understanding history really, really well. But it was very interesting because as we were working with communities, we could really start to see that there was deep disruptions from historical harm. And yet it was really difficult to bring community story up around that historical harm. So we thought we need to actually do some more learning around this, and we need to do it in a little bit of a different way. Now, one blessing when you're doing a larger research project is that you often have access to students, and we want to bring students on and have students start to help us to unpack information or do literature reviews or such. And so we brought on 3 students actually to help us start looking at new literature around historical harm. And it was interesting. I think for us, this was another place of surprise where all of a sudden we realized that literature has really increased. I know that, my surprise was that literature has exponentially increased since I started delving into the literature, which would have been probably over 20 years ago. I know that, when we start looking at residential school, as an example, when the Aboriginal Healing Foundation started in Canada, one of the things that happened with that is that there was a gathering of stories across communities that started to happen, and there was a gathering of stories around what is impacting the harm that people are caught in today. So there was this increase that started happening around that time, which would have been in the 1990s. And since that time, one of the things that started is it started a real push around people's unpacking of their history and around communities unpacking of their history. And there was a push to start actually getting people's stories published, getting stories together, and starting to look at the themes of particular stories and putting those things together and saying, what are the historical harms within our community and how is it that we understand them? I don't think that I had realized how much there was a change in the literature over the last 20 years. And so one of the things that we realized, and I showed you this particular slide because that slide is just a few of the boxes of actually what this is. Now, there's no way that you can actually read this, and that's not even the intention here, is to actually read it. The intention here is to actually look at a part of a comprehensive timeline that we started to put together that helped us to start understanding the actual amount of harm that we're working with within community. Sometimes when there is so much information, it's really, really difficult then for people to be able to unpack that information. It's too much. Anybody that's done any type of thesis work and has started to do work around understanding themes, you can probably recollect the 1,000 stickies that might be around you in a particular room. And, as you're trying to sort to yourself, how do I even start to think through looking at this thematically and sorting it out in any kind of particular order? We started to sort this by time frame, and we started to sort this by particular events. It's interesting, I use the example of residential school when I talk about community story of harm, because in community, what happens is that's often, when we talk about historical harm, often the conversation jumps to that place of residential school. That's just where it naturally jumps to. And it's because that's what is the most talked about within community. And there's been the most support and collecting of stories for that to be the most talked about. When we look at residential schools within this particular chart, residential schools, right from the time of them starting to them closing, the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, moving into the Common Experience Payment, moving into the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, moving into Reconciliation Canada, that whole journey makes up about 8 of the 300 boxes that we have on here. So this here was able to help us to start unpacking what those disruptions really look like within community and what they look like when we actually start to layer them within community. The importance of layering is because when we layer aspects of historical harm, it helps us understand current challenges at hand. And we have to understand current challenges at hand before we start looking at doing programming with community. You have to always know what might be the barriers to something being able to move in a fairly fluid way. And I think that for us, one of the things that we realized is that often programs and services will move into community and they'll say, we have a really good understanding of residential schools, so we know that there's going to be some intergenerational trauma. We know that there's going to be some disruptions for people around identity, around their understanding of culture, around language. So there's certain things that that are knowns around the things that might be barriers to the work that we're doing. I think for us, what we realized is that that was really limited, really limited information. And you have to understand at times that when we start looking at something like this, we're looking at about 12 different layers of active harm that are happening with communities. Often when you start looking at, at the research and around our understanding around resilience, generally speaking, for different people, there can be about 3 to 5 different harmful events that can happen that start to impact resilience. So when we're starting to now look at probably about 12 to 15 different events in community, as opposed to 3 to 5, it helps us understand that there's actually a great deal of trauma that we actually need to get better at working in and within in order to be able to fluidly move our programming and fluidly move really good information into communities that we're working together with. It's interesting, and this I just quite this is within PREVNet. This is a particular slide that I know has been very well documented, well researched, but also it's coming to be more understood. And we did a little bit of an addition to this. When we start looking at understanding child abuse, when we start looking at understanding relationship violence and bullying, and we know that there is particular pathways where one thing in the absence of intervention can lead into another another harmful event. In the absence of intervention can lead into another harmful event. So we know that there's particular trajectories that happen. One of the trajectories that we're really needing to add in our understanding is that of self-harm. In communities, with the Red Cross, one of the places that we're starting to respond quite more so now. Traditionally, it wasn't something it wasn't a place that we used to respond to, but we're starting to respond to social emergencies within communities. And we're starting to respond because communities are starting to declare states of emergency around youth suicides that are happening within communities. We know that that is linked into aspects of violence within community, in the very same way that dating aggression is, in the very same way that the rise of gangs is, in the very same way that aspects of community violence is. It's all linked into that place. And so we're realizing that we're needing to actually open up our thinking here as well and look at those trajectories, not just the trajectories of the aggressions that we were looking at, but also how people are harming themselves within community. So from that, we've really started to be able to unpack that look of colonization and that look of the fact that colonization actually is, it's not just that it has increased violence in the past, it's that it has created a pathway to normalize violence in today's present, in the presence of our communities today. And so too often at this point, we have this, we have just aspects of just normalized violence now within community. And we have aspects of these different crises around violence that are taking place. And we're talking about these crises almost in a normalized way because of the rate in which they are increasing. And so that is something that there has to be greater intervention around that. And the most effective way of intervening when we start looking at these layers, at these cycles and such, is to say, when we start looking now at culture, and culture being a protective mechanism, what does that then look like within communities? And that looks a few different ways. I'm going to show you a couple different ways that when we start looking to culture, what does that really mean within community? And when we look at colonization, what has really been broken down, and where do we, what does the intervention need to look like? When we start looking at culture as a protective mechanism, there is different layers. And this is, for me, this is actually a slide that I drew up because I like frameworks, and I like to put the picture together so I can see things in relation to each other. There's some things that Indigenous culture and community globally have in common. One of those things is that Indigenous culture is child-centered. And we have communities that it's very difficult to be child-centered when the adults within community are really struggling through trauma that has been uh, a part of their life and a part of their parents and grandparents' lives. Um, and so it's difficult to come back to that place. But when we start looking at any kind of programming or any kind of service, there has to be an intention of staying in that place of being child-centered. From there, we have to always recognize that within community, when you're looking through a cultural lens, what comes next is all my relations. And communities don't just see themselves in relation to the people within community, we're also in relation to the land in which we're living on, and we're in relation to the elements that are around. When we start looking at traditional principles, what the strength of looking at traditional principles and really reintegrating or integrating traditional principles into the ways of practice, into the ways of program, or into the ways of particular services, is that the principles guide what needs to be present around the guidelines and the framework for really anything that we're doing in conjunction with Indigenous communities. This particular diagram here, the example here, really focus on the focus here is on the Anishinaabe 7 traditional teachings, and the Anishinaabe and their 7 traditional teachings. The Anishinaabe people have been very generous with their traditional teachings, which has been very helpful in a lot of other areas of Canada, because in many areas where people, where the community isn't so clear about what their principles look like, they can actually borrow these principles. And they can say, what does this, so communities are often saying, we really want to reintegrate and bring back those traditional principles. But right now, we're not in a place quite yet of remembering what those are for our community, or we don't know all of those. And so so by using something like this, they can actually use that. And I wanted to also show this particular one here, and this is the Inuit principles in a very similar framework, where it's like the child's at the center, surrounded by all my relations, surrounded by then the traditional principles of the Inuit people. What is really amazing, I think, when we look here at the Inuit one, is that these are called the IQ principles. And the IQ principles are an active part of Inuit life. They're a very active part. It's interesting in that contact in for many of the Inuit peoples has really been within the last 100 years. There may have been contact, and points of contact quite a bit before that, but general contact really has been within the last 100 years. So for many people, it really is part of this particular generation that we're in, where contact has been strong. And so what that means is that communities, Inuit hamlets and community, are still really, really close to their traditional principles. This isn't something that's lost for Inuit peoples, not as much for many of the First Nations communities, where, like I said, it's not lost, but it's not necessarily all unpacked yet or remembered yet. For us, it was really important that we start to look at frameworks for culture, because we needed to not sit in that place of just understanding the trauma. It's too difficult to just sit in that place, and there has to be, and there is, there's a great deal of hope. And I think what happens is that we can even see by the literature, but by the fact that there has been so much concentration on the unpacking of trauma, what's happening is that there isn't necessarily that same level of concentration and time being spent to unpack the hope and to unpack those places. This is one of the places also where youth are really standing up and saying within community, we have a right to culture, and we have a right to language, and we have a right to know who we are as Indigenous youth, and what that means. What are our stories? Why is our language not strong within community? So it's really interesting. There was a particular movement that some might have heard of. It was called Idle No More, that happened a few years back, and it was one of the first times where there was actual a national collective of youth that were really standing up to say it's our right. It's culture is actually our right. And I think what we can really celebrate about that is that youth aren't just wanting to concentrate on the harm within communities. They're actually saying, give us that strength as well, and let us learn from that strength as well. In doing the research, there's we came to a place of actually really developing a conceptual model that we could understand this, that we could understand this better in. So for us, all of the different events that you can see within the cycle of violence are directly taken from that big chart that I showed you. And so they're organized here into a particular, just into an order that we kind of could make the most sense from, given the understanding of each of the lines within the chart. And so we organize those to help us to better understand the cycle of violence. But we also started to look at the circle of wellness and say, what are the themes that are really needed around that landing place, so that when we're working with community, we can also better understand and start to ask better questions around the landing place. And so if we're working in a canoe together, and that canoe is moving away from the cycle of violence and moving towards the circle of wellness, then how is it that we can work towards something if we don't ever talk about that? So we need to be able to start framing ways that we can start talking about that landing place of wellness, so that we can better work towards that and have a space to go to if we're leaving that. From communities, there's been some real particular learnings that they've stressed just very strongly to us. There's been a real stress that as soon as we start looking to solutions, a lot of times programs come into communities, or services to come into communities, because it offers a piece of the solution that communities are asking for. It's saying we need solutions to the current challenges. And many times those don't include culture. And it's one of the places where programs and services really lack today, in that often we haven't necessarily done enough of the work to actually make something cultural so that it can flow better into community when we bring things into community. So what happens is that we bring something into community, and the first thing that happens is that we need people within community to work with us so that it can then be customized and culturalized in order for it to work within the community. The challenge, though, is that the community is already working under several layers of trauma, and that creates a lot of it creates a lot of busyness. Community is busy. They're busy in addressing issues that are happening. So, so it's not helpful for programs or services to go in if they can't, if they haven't done the cultural work beforehand before they go in. It's really important that solutions have intergenerational involvement. It's really interesting in that communities, there's a real familial focus. There's a focus on the family, and a focus on healing can't be just for individuals. It has to be family and community based. And it's another challenge that we often have with various programs and services, in that we go into community, and if things are school-based programs, then youth are learning about particular aspects of harm, maybe bullying prevention, but nobody else around the community is learning about that. And so we ask youth to recognize certain things. We'll say, this is actually how to recognize this. This is how to understand this. This is how to talk to an adult. But if we don't talk to the adults as well, it's really difficult in that we're not helping them to then also protect the youth. And so what's happening is that when we piece out information and separate information by generations, meaning like by the school kids, by the parents, maybe by elders, it tends to not create, I think, the solution that we had really hoped that it would help create. We have to increase our understanding of root causes of violence, and this is one of those places where people often go into community and think that if they have a good understanding of residential school, that means that they understand historical harm. And what we've learned is that that's not necessarily the case, because historical harm is just much bigger. It's much bigger than residential school. We have to look at creating a strength-based foundation. And so what that means is that, looking back to that conceptual model that I showed you, we have to start looking at the circle of wellness. And we have to start looking thematically, like those were, we kind of put the three main themes within each one of those quadrants. And we have to start looking at that and saying, how do we bring in the information also of those, so that we're always looking towards, if you're looking at taking, particular behaviors out of, or if you're saying, let's not do this, then you always have to jump to that let's do this. And when we're working with healthy youth relationships in community, they have to include culture. And the need for community-driven solutions needs to come also from community. We've learned that also really, really strongly. I'm not going to show that. Sorry. When we look at the canoe, there's particular aspects here that are really important to know. It's really interesting. The circle of wellness, when we started to unpack the circle of wellness, we started to unpack the understanding of what do we need to understand about that place of wellness within community in order to do the best work towards community. One of the things that we realized in that part of our research journey is that we can help to when we look at the circle of wellness, we can help with actually unpacking some of the themes that maybe we need to understand. But in terms of really defining what that looks like, that's up to a community to define what their wellness looks like. That's never, ever up to an outsider and a person not belonging to particular communities. It's never, ever up to us to say to a community, this is what wellness needs to look like for you. It's never up to us. So we can help around that part of the journey, but really the ownership of that it has nothing to do with us. But for us, what's really strong is we need to know what the work of the canoe is. We need to know, how do we paddle together so that community can start working more towards their place of wellness. So it's really interesting because what we started to identify is we started to look at the places of healing that need to happen that really the cycle of violence harmed. So when we started to unpack that a little bit better, there was particular things that started to rise up. And as those things rose, then we also started to look at the literature that existed around these that says, how is it that these particular things happen? How do movements towards these things happen? And it's really interesting because for us, what this meant is it meant that we had a little bit of a guide that could start helping us to work better for community. And I think that for us, really right at the outset, that was our goal, is we thought we want to be able to work better for community. And so we need to do the work so that we're doing that in a better way. In many of our programs, we're not going to be able to integrate all of the different points that are within this pathway to healing. And in many of our programs, we don't use the word healing. But this is a community word. And within community is very, very clear that for them, that process of change and the process towards a circle of wellness is a healing process. Different communities do different things on here in a lot of creative ways. You know, I'll give you an example. Like when we look at the physical, we look at connecting to land and stewardship. For people that are living in urban areas, it's really, really difficult to create just the whole behavior and action around stewardship when there's all of these either skyscrapers around you or a lot of cement, you know, a lot of cement around you, you know, and structures around you. You know, in places like Vancouver, they've done this in such creative ways. And so, I mean, you can walk downtown Vancouver, you can walk around many different areas of Vancouver, and there is cultural representation all over the place, in the murals that are in the buildings, in the sculptures that are about town, on the manhole covers. You know, when you walk down the street, there's many streets downtown Vancouver where the whole street you'll be walking down and there's different Indigenous designs on the manhole covers as you're walking down the street. And it's really interesting because community has to be creative around what you know, how they show their connection to that space and how they can actually still steward land that has a different structure than, you know, and it just is under a different way, you know. When we start looking at the emotional, you know, this is probably the place where many of us that work in programs or services, we probably would relate more in here, and that we have to look at, you know, how do we create pathways to healthy relationships? How do we create pathways to family connectivity? How do we create pathways to supporting during difficult experiences? You know, so it's interesting here. We started to, like I said, just to unpack those different places that we can actually that we can contribute towards. You know, again, what this was able to do, I know that for us and for the violence prevention work and the and the protection work that we were working within, and the responding to social emergency work, what happened with this is that for us, it gives us a lens that we can look at and say, what are the things on here that we're doing? Because they have to connect to something. If they don't connect to something on here, we're not doing the best that we possibly can with community. Learning through relationships. One of the things, you know, I wanted to actually just share some of the things that are happening within communities that are ways of tying those things together. There's a particular program in RVAT. RVAT is a community that we've worked closely with for many, many years, and it was one of our research communities. They have a program called the Young Hunters Program, and that particular program is it was started by one particular family within the community that could see that where there was not where there wasn't adult involvement or there wasn't father involvement in particular children's lives, and they were already they were getting a little bit older. They were probably already 8, 9, maybe 10 years old. At that point, a child, it was time for them to learn hunting within their community. And so if it was time for them to learn that, who was going to teach them that if there wasn't father or grandfather involvement? So they started a program called the Young Hunters, and they asked particular elders, and elders, I think really, primarily men elders within the community, to come together and to actually be the mentors and the teachers for this collective of younger boys. And it's a program that they couldn't have imagined how successful this particular program would become. And now it's turned into a real active program within community where there is about 6 elders, and what they do is they work with youth through the whole year, and they teach them about cultural values. They teach them about the cultural values and the knowledge that they need to know. They teach them about the Inuit protocols that they need to know in order to learn the things on the land. And, the Young Hunters is much more than just hunting. It's also about how do we survive on the land, and, why all of those teachings are really important in that whole process. When we look at...
Shelley, it's when you wanted me to let you know when you had 10 minutes.
Okay, and I've got 10 minutes?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. So when we look at the current challenges and the and ongoing harm, it's really important, like I said, that we understand intergenerational trauma. There's many aspects of climate change that are really starting to create various environmental disasters within community. And, the further we go north, the greater food insecurity is within communities. There's housing crisis, mental health crisis. There's various diseases that are on the rise. Example would be TB. When we look at disruptions of family relationships, again, understanding historical harm here is helping us to understand the things that are really keeping families disconnected, and keeping active various relationship challenges. And so when we start looking then at things that we need to learn, our learning in relationship. This year, I have some Inuit examples and some non-Inuit, examples. When we look at romantic relationships of adult role models, and if those adult relationships have various aspects of harm or violence that are normalized within it, then what happens is that for the youth that we're working with, we have to understand what we need to undo a little bit, what we need to maybe teach a little bit around how that might have come to be, and then how we need to then start to focus on looking at the landing place that they would like and how to ask questions around the landing place that they would like. Often we find with many of our youth is that their understanding of being in relationship is, there's a lot of fractured learnings within that. And so what happens is that we have to learn, how do we start tying those different pieces together? When we start learning about relationships in school and home, we have to just really be honest about what we're working in. And we have to start to get a little bit, I think, either more bold or maybe more brave around how we talk to youth about the challenges in their lives, and the challenges around violence and aspects of violence in their lives. We've worked with so many youth where they often talk about different parts of harm we had one youth recently that were saying that they said, in our school, there isn't one person that graduates in the school that hasn't had one friend that's committed suicide. And so we have to start talking about mental health issues, and we have to start talking about, alcohol addiction within the family, aspects of school, school-based violence, and the cyclical nature of harm, and the cyclical nature of harm that really creates risks and contributes towards risk and aggression that's happening, for children and for their families. When we talk a little bit about guidelines for programming, it's really interesting in that in many of the guidelines and many of the programs that we often have different different values within that are embedded within those, and so when we work with youth, we'll say, the guidelines for being together, we want to come from a respectful place, and we want to come from a place where it's we really value honesty. But one thing that we need to also do is we need to understand Indigenous values a little bit better and figure out how do we land ourselves within some of those Indigenous values. And so we can start using that language, because that language alone, it promotes culture and it promotes healing for the youth that we're working with. Often within community, what happens is that we have perpetrators and we have people that have been harmed that are often on journeys together. And so we need to really look at how do we bring these things together, as opposed to how do we not work with perpetrators and just work with those that have been harmed. Because in community, there's a real desire that everybody all works together to create the solution. And we find that when we do that, then that really, it works the best for everybody. How do, schools can adapt resource drawings from cultural contexts. Schools can better include elders and knowledge keepers. I think that programs are starting to do a little bit better around that. But where we have to be cognizant is that if there's, say, 3 or 4 different programs that are going into a school, and we're all asking for the same elders to be a support, then sometimes we're asking a lot of a very few people. So what's helpful is, again, if the programs can learn as much as is possible themselves, then and really do some figuring around how culture can be embedded into program, it doesn't put so much weight on a very few people within either the school or a youth environment where we're sharing information. And it's really interesting. One thing that we really learned as well within community is that many times teachers and people that run programs within community are often temporary within community. And so there needs to actually be better engagement from either people providing programs or even teachers within the program. It's when teachers can be the role models for healthy relationships in youth lives, then that's a really, really good thing within community. I thought maybe we could just talk a little bit about, or I could just talk a little bit about some of the examples of activities that we've seen happen within community. This particular example, let's see. I'm going to use actually the protection instruments, just the bottom example here. There's 3 different examples here, but when we look at any kind of programming or service within community, one of the things that we often don't integrate as much as we can. Some programs do, but I've seen many different programs that could do this a little bit more. We don't often integrate different conventions or declarations from the UN that have great rights-based language. And this is something that communities are actually asking us to do a little bit better. There wasn't as much understanding around protection instruments until the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was written. And since that's come to be, it's become easier for us to actually reflect and refer to various rights-based instruments within community. And as we do that, what happens is that we're really finding the youth are loving that information, more so I think than what we even maybe realized that they would. But it frames their culture in the language of rights. And for many of our youth and many of our families, there is an inherent belief and there's an inherent knowledge that their culture, their language, their identity, that there is rights associated with that. But what's great about the conventions is that it helps to frame that language, which is really helpful in any program or service. When we're starting to look at responding to disclosures of harm within community, it's important to listen to youth stories of harm. And part of the importance of that is that when we listen to the youth stories of harm, it helps us to understand a little bit better the different layers of trauma that have impacted their family. And when we start to understand the layers of trauma that have impacted their family, it's actually easier for us to impact some of the solutions that could really be helpful for those for the youth that are really talking to us. And the better that we can do there, the more safe, the more supported they feel, and often it creates the best environment for them to actually move to a better place. When we start looking at how we actually meet some of the challenges that we are so often seen, but really not sure how to engage in, I would say that there's some real particular learning that we need to do before engagement in programs and services, or at least while we're engaging, in the program and services within Indigenous communities. Understanding historical harm, not just understanding residential school, but really understanding different layers of trauma and how that impacts the communities that we're in, the communities that we're working with, the communities that we're really trying to help build solutions with. In the absence of that, there's going to be holes in the program. There's going to be holes in the content, and because we're not creating the right. It's kind of like when you cup your hands and you kind of see, it's kind of like how do we hold particular things, and how do we hold things through harm to move forward. Sometimes in the absence of understanding what harm has truly done to impact where youth are today, often what we're holding is a colander, and we don't understand why there's all these holes that are still pouring through. And many times it's in our understanding of the context of the harm that actually it helps to create a colander as opposed to a bowl. We know that we have to. We know that we when we decide to be present around particular solutions, presence needs to not have short time frames attached to it. Many times we get funding opportunities, and that funding gives us the opportunity to work in a place for a year. And really, it takes that long to just build relationship. And so what happens is that it doesn't give enough time to start to build something and then have what we're building start to go somewhere, to move to positive solutions. So I think that, in many ways, when we start looking at funding opportunities, we need to start looking at how we can get longer funding opportunities. And that is actually something that's starting to happen a little bit more now, which is great. I mean, that, it's really, really helpful. If funding opportunities can be, instead of 2 years or even 3, if they can be 5 years, if they could be more than that, I know that that's a difficult thing, but if they can be more, it's really, really helpful, because when we delve into community and start the relationships of looking at solutions, it takes a long time. And encouraging efforts to find ways to overcome the challenges. It's really interesting. I think that there is lots and lots of ideas within community, but again, programs and services tend to put community into a pie that's separated. And so it's like, we just work with this group, or we just work with this group. And so we have to find better ways of having solutions be community focused as opposed to just school focused or parent focused or crime prevention focused, or many times we have to start looking at ways to actually really expand the solutions to be more inclusive of everybody. So really, in closing, I think that for me, it's there's a few different things that I always stress. I always stress that, one thing that we've learned a great deal is that for all of us that we come from a really good place of wanting to participate to help create change within community. And I think that sometimes that really good intention goes straight to the place of, okay, now what can we do? And sometimes the first things that we need to actually start doing is we need to actually just start saying, what do we need to read? What do we need to start to study a little bit? How do we need to understand how we've gotten to a place where we're working through great challenges? And many times it really starts there. It really starts with the learning that's needed by us in order to engage in really good ways. And we need to really leave space for cultural solutions to different things. When we bring programs in, I think that we need to start seeing programs and different services as a conduit towards a place of wellness that community is wanting to define for themselves, is able to define for themselves, and needs to define for themselves. And often the work that we're doing is a conduit towards that. And so we need to have less attachment to that and realize that we're a part of solution, and we need to stay for a little while so that we can do a really good job in that time frame and in the work that we had said we wanted to really contribute towards. But really, at that point, then it's like we need to let me think. How do I say that? We need to be able to be a great conduit and a great ally and a great support for a period of time that we've really passed on as much good knowledge as we can, and and be in better relation really within communities while there. I think I'll I think I will leave it there because I mean, we have a little bit of time for questions. I don't know that there was many questions. I'm not quite sure, but I will let Stacy and Wendy let me know that.
Okay, well, I want to thank you. What a powerful and rich presentation that you really reflects your deep experience, your deep knowledge, and your deep conceptualization of these issues. So thank you, Shell. And we do have some questions, so I'm going to perhaps start with some of the questions, and we'll see how many we can get through. Is that all right?
Yep.
So one question that came up is, from people in the group is, can we use the conceptual model in our project delivery / teachings?
You can. You just have to cite it. And so I can, and I think that you had said, Stacy, that you would be sending a copy of the PowerPoint out so that people could actually see it. I think that in the, let's see, I just want to, it's right there. Okay. Yeah, because as long as it's used in like this particular picture, this is the right picture to use, and it's cited on there, so it actually says who created the conceptual model. So I'm quite fine with that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. We also, another question was, in a framework of culture as a protective mechanism, how can we respect religious community beliefs?
Well, when we look at, just re-say that question.
The question was, in a framework of culture as a protective mechanism, how can we respect religious community beliefs?
Well, it's really interesting. Within community, there is there's a real diversity of spiritual practice. Spiritual practice in community can be traditional Indigenous practice. It can also be it can be part of the Catholic Church. It can be part of the Pentecostal Church, and so spiritual practice. What's really interesting is that it's not for us to define. Like, that's one of those places when we look at the circle of wellness, these aren't things for us to define. We've worked really closely with communities where they're really traditional, and we've worked really closely with communities where there is strong churches within the community, and really the membership of community all belongs to one of the churches within community. Regardless of which community, there's a strong belief of connection to the land. There's a strong belief in the right to language, in the right to particular ways of being, particular cultural ways of being, like hunting, knowing your traditional crafts and such. Culture is much, much bigger than actual how you express your spiritual connection to the Creator. It's much bigger than that. So I don't think that it needs to be a barrier. I think that it needs to be something that, within the community that you're working in, you just need to be cognizant that there's going to be many different spiritual ways of being, and that how community practices that is how they practice it.
Okay, this question's a bit related to that, I think. In your experience, what adaptations need to be made to community interventions to the core principles among different Indigenous communities? So, for example, like a program that was originally designed for an Anishinaabe community, but meant to be delivered in a different community.
Yeah. It's interesting. We have we have communities that, where there's a particular program, and it was Anishinaabe or Cree that really helped to do that. And then that community was maybe asked for within Inuit hamlets. So there's a few different specific changes that need to happen. There's national Indigenous groups, like the Inuit. There's the ITK, the Inuit Tamariki Kapsari, that operates out of Ottawa. And many times, I think that we need to take advantage of actually connecting with national Indigenous bodies and say, could we bring in an Inuit person that could help us, that we could contract, they could actually help us to look through, to do some analysis around the programs, and to start saying, what is the adaptation that needs to happen? Because many times that is what happens, Wendy, is that particular programs are designed for a nation group or by by a collective of people, and there was one Indigenous person, and that Indigenous person was from a particular nation group. And so it has the essence then of that particular nation group, as opposed to being fitting across many places. So I think that, I think it's helpful if we could actually bring more Indigenous people in when we're doing design. And it's also helpful to, I'll leave it there.
Okay, so this is another question that sort of comes directly from that. And it's, what are the first steps in a non-Indigenous service providers in making connection with Indigenous community leaders like elders and knowledge keepers? You might have just said one.
Yeah, it might, for somebody that going into community, generally speaking, you're going in because you were invited in. I think what happens is that when you're invited in, there should be more questions at the outset of the program. So the program, I think that there needs to be some questions that they ask around what's the information that that we need to know before going in. Tell me a little bit more about your community. So there needs to be this starting place that's a little bit more expanded from the program around where they're going to, and whether then they can start doing a little bit of a not necessarily a literature review, but they can definitely do a bit of a Google search around. They can look up that community, they can look at the demographics, they can look at the specific challenges, they can find out a bit more about other programs that are there. So a lot of times it's really, it's so much about the upfront work that service providers or programs need to do beforehand.
Okay, and I know we're right at the end of our time, but I do have one last question if I can, which is, could you elaborate a little bit more on what child-centered care would look like within a community?
It's interesting. It's not necessarily child-centered care. It's a child-centered lens. So when we look at traditional culture operated from a child-centered place, which meant that when you look at all activities that happen within the community, they happen first through the lens of how does this impact, or how is this for our children? And and when you're looking at cultures of the land, the land is harsh. Like land can be really harsh, and so in that, it means that you have to be pretty strong in order to survive on the land. So it's the adults that are really surviving on the land. Their lens first has to be towards the children to make sure that all aspects of their wellness are taken care of before they think about what they need themselves. Many programs that go into community, we don't necessarily think through that lens. And so if we were thinking through the lens of child-centeredness, again, it's a lens, so it's not necessarily that's not a process. It's how we view through. We would work differently. I think that our work days would look differently. I think that our like how we would support mothers would look differently. We'd have a lot more support structures to mothers. Our intervention systems often are systems of removal as opposed to systems of support for the adults so that they can actually create that stronger place to remain child-centered. So our child protection system, our criminal justice system, often even our health system is all they are all through the lens of removal. So the thing is that that's not a child-centered lens. That's an intervention lens that really focuses on who you want to look after the most often is either the service provider or the adult. Does that answer that, Wendy?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much. Well, again, I want to thank you for sharing your wisdom and your thought and your deep learning and experience from working in the communities for over 20 years. I want to also thank the audience for participating and asking such rich and deep questions. Please know that this session has been recorded, so it will be available afterwards, that you can come back to it and return. And again, I'd like to encourage you to please complete the evaluation form so that we can ensure that we're meeting your needs with all of our webinars. So thank you again for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you, Shelley, for being with us and spending this incredible time. Thank you.
Thank you.